On February 3rd, 1509, in the Arabian Sea off the coast of India, a small Portuguese fleet of barely 18 ships squared off against a joint naval force of around 200 vessels. This armada belonged to a rare trans-regional coalition comprised of Mamluk Egypt, the Gujarat Sultanate, and the maritime kingdom of Calicut, determined to halt Portuguese control of Indian Ocean commerce. By sunset, that coalition was shattered, and a trading system that had dominated the Indian Ocean for 1,000 years suddenly had a new master. This is the forgotten Battle of Diu, the day a handful of European ships seized the Indian Ocean. For most of the Middle Ages, the center of global trade wasn't London, Amsterdam, or Lisbon. It was the Indian Ocean, a vast expanse of water stretching from East Africa to India and Southeast Asia, crisscrossed by a dense network of trade routes linking these ports. Dhows, junks, and galleys carried pepper from India, nutmeg and cloves from the Spice Islands, fine textiles from Gujarat and Bengal, and porcelains and silks from China. If you were a European craving pepper on your table or silk on your back, this trade network mattered. Spices left India in the holds of Muslim and Indian ships. They crossed the Arabian Sea, moved up through the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, passed through Egyptian, Yemeni, and Levantine ports, and finally trickled into Europe through a handful of Italian city-states, primarily Venice. Venice was the middleman of this world, the distribution center. Venetian merchants didn't sail to India themselves. They bought from Muslim and Eastern traders, marked up the goods, and sold them on to the rest of Europe at an enormous profit. The real power in this system lay with the states that controlled the sea routes and choke points: the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, the rulers of the Arabian and Indian coasts, and the great port cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. On the far western edge of Europe, tiny Portugal wanted a piece of the action. More accurately, it wanted to break the system entirely. Portuguese kings backed voyages down the coast of Africa, sailing treacherous waters around the Cape of Good Hope at its southern tip, effectively going straight to the source. If they could reach India by sea and buy spices directly, they could undercut Venice, weaken Muslim powers, and turn Lisbon into the new gateway of global trade. It was a huge gamble. Rather than compete within the Venetian system, Portugal wanted to bypass it entirely. By the time the Portuguese finally reached the Indian Ocean at the end of the 15th century, they were not interested in playing by local rules. They arrived in armed caravels and carracks, bristling with cannon. They attacked rival shipping, bombarded ports that refused them favorable terms, and tried to insert themselves into the existing trade networks by force. For coastal rulers from East Africa to India, these newcomers were not just merchants, they were pirates backed by a kingdom. The reaction was predictable. A coalition began to form among those who saw Portuguese expansion as an existential threat. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which relied heavily on taxing Red Sea trade, committed ships and men. The Sultan of Gujarat, one of the key players on India's western coast, joined in. Forces from Calicut, a major spice port and Portuguese rival, also joined the alliance. Finally, the Ottomans supplied expertise and artillery. The coalition's plan was straightforward: assemble a large fleet at the port of Diu on the coast of Gujarat and deliver a decisive blow. If they could destroy the Portuguese squadron operating in the region, they could nip this European intrusion in the bud. Standing in their way was Dom Francisco de Almeida, the Portuguese viceroy in India. Almeida was the architect and enforcer of Portuguese sea power in Asia. He was also a grieving father, seeking vengeance. In earlier fighting against the same coalition, his son had been killed. The coming battle was both a test of Portugal's entire eastern project and an intensely personal reckoning for its commander. On paper, the coalition's advantage was overwhelming. Sources differ on the exact numbers, but they had around 200 vessels of various types: oared galleys, local sailing ships, and armed merchantmen. Almeida brought perhaps 18 to 20 ships, but within those numbers hid a crucial imbalance. Portuguese carracks were high-sided, ocean-going warships built to mount heavy cannon. They could take punishment and deliver it at range. Many of their opponents sailed in lower, lighter craft intended for coastal waters and boarding actions, not slugging matches with floating artillery platforms. In early February of 1509, Almeida sailed north and found the coalition anchored off of Diu. The coalition trusted in their superior numbers and in the familiarity of home waters. Almeida trusted in his guns, his seamanship, and the discipline of crews hardened by long ocean voyages. Plus, he was driven by a desire to avenge his dead son. The wind favored the Portuguese. Using it carefully, Almeida positioned his fleet so that the fighting would take place in the confined waters near the port, where the coalition ships lay crowded together. In such a cramped anchorage, the numeric advantage of the Allied fleet was blunted. There was simply less room to maneuver. Their greater numbers were not a factor. When the battle opened, the Portuguese held the range. Rather than charge in for boarding, they stood off and let their artillery do its work. Portuguese ships at Diu were armed with heavy bronze cannon mounted for broadside fire, turning naval combat from boarding actions into artillery warfare. Broadside after broadside smashed into the packed enemy ships. Coalition vessels, meant to carry cargo and men, sat lower in the water with less freeboard and weaker construction. They suffered terribly from this bombardment. Fires broke out, masts splintered, decks were swept by iron and stone. The coalition's best chance lay in closing the distance. If their galleys and fighting ships could get alongside the Portuguese, their experienced warriors might reduce the fight to hand-to-hand combat, where numbers and ferocity could matter more than gunnery. Several times groups of ships tried to surge forward, oars digging into the water as they drove for the Portuguese line. Each attempt ran into disciplined, concentrated fire. Ships were holed below the waterline, dismasted, or set ablaze before they could grapple. Some were crippled and drifted helplessly under continued bombardment. Where boarding actions did occur, they did so on Portuguese terms. From their higher decks, the Portuguese could shoot and stab down into the crowded attackers, using firearms, crossbows, and pikes to deadly effect. Boarding parties tried to climb up, while Portuguese projectiles rained down upon them, and the ocean filled with their dead and dying. As the hours wore on, the cohesion of the coalition fleet began to unravel. Key commanders were killed or captured, and flagship vessels were sunk or overrun. Fear and confusion spread. Captains cut their anchor cables in panic, trying to flee. From the walls and shore of Diu, onlookers watched as the fleet that was supposed to protect them disintegrated under fire. The Portuguese had taken some casualties, but their fleet remained intact and battle-worthy. The coalition fleet, by contrast, ceased to exist as a serious naval force. It was wiped out. In a single day, the attempt to sweep the Europeans from the Indian Ocean had failed catastrophically. The consequences along India's west coast were immediate. Without a strong fleet to oppose them, the Portuguese now had uncontested naval dominance in key stretches of the Arabian Sea. Local rulers who had gambled on the coalition's protection were forced to reconsider. Many chose to come to terms with Almeida, signing treaties, granting trading privileges, and allowing the construction of fortified bases rather than risk bombardment and blockade. Over the following years, the pattern of trade began to shift. Cargo that had once reliably moved through the Red Sea and across to Alexandria and Venice increasingly diverted around Africa and straight into Lisbon. Venice, deprived of its former monopoly position, entered into a slow decline. The Mamluk Sultanate, cut off from a major source of revenue, weakened significantly. The Battle of Diu was far more than a local contest between rival fleets. It marked the moment when a European power proved that with a relatively small but modern navy, backed by artillery and fortified positions, it could dominate distant seas and destroy long-established trade systems. This model, using naval firepower to secure coastal bases and to control sea lanes, would be refined by later Portuguese viceroys and then imitated by the Dutch and the British. Half a millennium later, the silhouettes on the horizon have changed. Wooden carracks have given way to steel container ships. But if you plot today's shipping routes across the Indian Ocean and down the coast of Africa, you can still trace the legacy of that February day off Diu. The idea that a European maritime power could control crucial sea lanes, bypass old intermediaries, and redirect the flow of global trade took a decisive step forward here. 18 ships, a single day's fighting, and a trading system that had dominated the Indian Ocean for 1,000 years was overturned. The Battle of Diu is a quiet but critical hinge in world history, the moment when the Indian Ocean began, slowly, to become Europe's ocean.